At this point, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce you all to the two speakers that will be addressing you during this webinar today. And this is, again, the second in a four-part series of the Mythcracker series. This particular session will be about the myth of the private key. Today we have joining us Mr. Matthew McKenna. He's our Chief Commercial Strategy Officer. And he will actually be working through the presentation, but he actually brings 10 years of high-tech sales and marketing management experience to us here at SSH Communication Security, and he is responsible for a multitude of different aspects of the company, and his expertise and business acumen will come through during this presentation. Supporting him today will be Mr. Joe Scaff. He's the Director of Global Customer Services, and he's responsible for managing all of the technical sales and support and professional services here at SSH Communication Security. He has over 12 years of experience in the information technology area and network communications industry. Without further ado, I would like to now turn this over to Matthew to begin the presentation. Again, if you guys have any questions during this presentation, please use the question chat box and we will address those during the session. Matthew?
Thank you, Ruben. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today to talk about part 2, the myth of the private key. This is actually a really fun topic for us. As we talk with our customers, we usually see the topic of key management being addressed from one or two angles in organizations. Either we see key management being run by cryptography teams, from a PKI perspective, where both certificates and SSH user keys want to be brought together from under a single umbrella within the organization. And then the other side where we see this topic being addressed is from the side of access management, identity access management, and privilege access management. And so we see a little bit these two worlds kind of coming together and merging here as we go into this topic. But one of the common themes that we always run into with our customers, regardless of what angle we're taking this from, comes down to the topic of the private key. And we sometimes get our customers, when we're having these discussions, saying, well, we have a policy. We need to get all of our private keys under control, and we need to get them locked down. We need to get our private keys under control. And we asked the questions to this. We said, well, how and why? And so what we want to talk a little bit about today, and why we titled this The Myth of the Private Key, is we want to talk a little bit about our philosophy of how we see this challenge, and talk about some of these issues of what does it really mean, to get the private key under control within our environment. So what I have for you in store today as we go through this is just going to give you a real quick introduction about SSH Communication Security. I'm going to talk a little bit about, do a little 101 on SSH, just for those who may be new to SSH or joining us for the first time here. Why is this so important? Why is the topic of SSH coming up more and more now? We see more and more mentioning of this in the news. And this is an issue that sat in the underworld of Unix administration for the last 10 to 15 years, but it's really now coming more into the limelight in the forefront of a real access control concern for enterprises. We're going to talk a little bit about how SSH keys really work. And then we're going to do a case study with you after we talk about these myths of the private key. And there's 4 myths that we're going to go through in detail today. We're going to talk a little bit about SSH as an attack vector. We're going to take you through a case study. We're going to show you some statistics of an SSH health check that we've done in the financial industry, and kind of show you and demonstrate a little bit where our thinking is coming from this. And then, of course, we're going to provide you guidance and advice on how you can go about approaching this and resolving this challenge within your organization from the perspective of policy controls, how we should be thinking about policy controls, what side of the equation we should be thinking of policy controls, and what process we should actually be going through to resolve the challenge. And then we'll lead you some more reading. So very quickly, many times when we're out there with our customers, or we're out there at trade shows, many people say, well, gee, I've heard of SSH, but I didn't know SSH was a company as well. Well, SSH Communication Security is a company which is fully dedicated. We are the inventors of the SSH protocol, and we're fully dedicated to helping our customers and the marketplace get control of access-related challenges around the SSH protocol. And our big piece of our philosophy with our customers is how do we do this without disrupting the existing process flows, without having to re-architect network topologies and whatnot. So this is what we're fully dedicated and focused to. And we've taken this from two perspectives. One is, how do we get the challenge of SSH user key-based authentication under control for interactive and machine-to-machine access? And how do we get control of the misuse of this protocol from the encrypted session side, regardless of whether that's an interactive session or a machine-to-machine session? We see a lot of misuse of the protocol out there. And so those are the two challenges that we've kind of dedicated ourselves to solving in the marketplace. So let's talk about what is SSH. Very simply, if you look at this tube in front of you, it's basically a tube which is providing us encryption around data in transit. And it has two primary use cases. It basically has the use case of remote administrative access for Linux and Unix administrators. And on the other side, it provides us the capabilities of secure file transfer. Now, there's three layers to this protocol. There's that host authentication layer, which lets us know that this machine can talk to this other machine, that the client can talk to the server. There's the user authentication layer, which lets us know that the user on that client may access this application on this server. And then there are these things called the subchannels of the protocol. And the subchannels is where it starts to get a little bit tricky and where the protocol tends to get misused, where people start to use tunneling in ways that are not really ideal from our security policies and perspective, way people may use agent forwarding back to their home desktops and be pushing data back to their home desktops outbound out of the organization and whatnot. So a little bit about these subchannels of the protocol as well. Now, why is SSH important? We've played around with this idea at SSH. We said SSH keeps the world running, and we thought, well, are we thinking too much of ourselves there? And we considered it, and we said, okay, this is the primary means. This is pre-installed on every single Unix, Linux distribution out there that comes out of the box. Basically, it is one of the three most widely used protocols in the world, being SSL, IPsec, and SSH. It comes on the majority of our routers, switches, firewalls. It sits in the motherboard of our computer. It's a primary means of us sending data from one machine to another machine. It's sitting everywhere. It sits in our point of sale systems. It's sitting in our trading platforms. It's essentially everywhere. And if we think about this, it touches us in multiple areas. If we think about this usage on premise, this is the mechanism that administrators use to access servers, provide maintenance and support. It's the way we're moving data internally around our enterprise. It's the way we're accessing our network devices. And then if we think about that access from our supply chain, if we think about the integrated supply chain nowadays, this is the primary means by which our third-party contractors and vendors and partners are actually exchanging data with us and offering using SSH. And those SSH inbound file transfers are often not being controlled and not being inspected. The partners are free to upload their keys into the environment. And this potentially provides us a little bit of an issue from an access control perspective. The same goes if we look at this transformation in the cloud, is we see that our vendors as well as our own internal administrators, they now have access into our cloud environment. And again, we're using SSH a lot here to move data in, to take remote access. So SSH is kind of connecting and bringing these worlds together, and it's essentially that primary means of access. And this tool, it's a very powerful tool, and it has capabilities which are to the benefits and are enablers within our business. However, these protocol can often be misused. A lot of you have seen kind of the recent news of firewalls essentially being brute forced using SSH backdoors. We've seen network devices being deployed with the same private host key out there across all these devices. On the good side, the data in transit encryption, it's there to prevent the man-in-the-middle attacks. It protects our information, but at the same time, our security operations are blind to what's coming through in these encrypted sessions. And this is the big challenge that we hear a lot about is, hey, I have this SSH-based access that's coming through my firewalls. I can't actually see what's going on in this. I can't make sense of this information, and I don't want to turn on that capability that may exist in some of the advanced firewalls today because it just slows down things too much. There's too many rules to manage around this, and it becomes too challenging. Remote access to applications and systems, right? Again, it's very convenient. An admin's called up at 3 a.m. in the morning, has to go bring back up something. It's a very convenient way to go gain access to that system. At the same time, it's also very easy for malicious insiders, third parties to misuse, to compromise not only those existing production applications, but also thinking about it from a resilience perspective, our disaster recovery systems. Same thing goes for command execution. We see a lot of the tunnels being used, the sub-channels of the protocol often being misused to exfiltrate data out of organizations while it's being blind to the security operations team. So these are a little bit of the concerns. And then from the tunneling perspective, how often do we see the dev to prod connectivity where a developer will go into their test environment, they will use SSH to tunnel across to production, they will drop in a new key pair, and boom, we now have access directly from our desktop into the production environment and can run commands there. And potentially we're bypassing our privileged access management infrastructures utilizing these type of techniques. We're also potentially bypassing corporate firewall policies. Real quick, before we jump into the myths here, the essentials of authentication, and this is a real key piece to keep in mind here as we're talking today. So there's two pieces to the equation here. You have the private key and the public key. And think of the private key as your home key to your house. And think of the public key as the lock to the door of your house. And one of the things that we see is typically every employee who has the capability to generate an SSH user key usually owns that key pair. And this is part of the challenge that we see in enterprises today is there's not a lot of ownership around those SSH user keys, regardless of whether that's for an interactive usage, whether that's for third-party access into environments, whether that's for application machine-to-machine connectivity. We see that this is a really important topic here, and of course it goes down to, well, partially we don't know what's out there. We don't have visibility. We can't map those trusts. We don't know what's out there. We're not monitoring how these keys are being used and authenticating in the environment. And this poses us some challenges to get control and assign that ownership back from an identity perspective in the environment. But keep that in mind again. SSH Private Key is the key to your house, and the public key is the lock, because this is really important now as we go into the myths of the private key. And now there's 4 myths that we're going to address today. The first myth is that keys and passwords are the same. We very often hear that, well, my SSH user keys, we're going to manage these the same passwords. They're the same exact things. And we're going to talk a little bit about why this is not really an accurate statement and why this needs a little bit further consideration. Second myth, well, if I get all the private keys under control, I have control of my environment. To go undertake. Third myth is, well, if I can control the private key, I can really lock down access to the environment. And we're going to take that again, that previous slide that I showed, and we're going to think about it as if you've lost all the keys we're going to talk about rotating my keys will make me more secure. And this is a little bit of a lead-in into the next session that we're going to have, but it also relates into this myth of the private key. So let's talk about the first myth here. SSH user keys and passwords are the same. Let's take a look at this and examine this a little bit more closely here. First off, is one of the connections is that passwords are primarily related to a user account, and they can provide access to a multitude of machines, through their connectivity with LDAP and AD. But they're related to user accounts, and SSH user keys don't have to be. A lot of individuals can freely set up. If you have access to SSH, you often can generate a key without any restrictions in your environment, and often we're not inventorying these keys, and we're not keeping and assigning ownership and tracking this and inventorying this. And SSH doesn't have to be related to a user account. We want it to be. We want to know what it's related to, but often we don't. Passwords usually have expiration time on it. With our tools and our systems there, from an administrative perspective, we can set rules in place that, hey, every 30 days, our passwords need to be rotated. And they're going to expire, and you're going to get a notice, and you're going to have to go generate that new password. SSH user keys have no expiration date on them, and this is part of the challenge that's out there in the environment today, is that we have a legacy of 10 to 15 years potentially of SSH user keys spread out across our environment, which we have no accountability and visibility for. And so SSH user keys don't have those expiration times on them. Passwords usually can't be generated without oversight. There's usually a process for this, which is controlling. SSH user keys often can and often are created without the oversight. Passwords, on the one side, are used very frequently for interactive authentication. Of course, yes, you can embed passwords and scripts for machine-to-machine connectivity, and there are privileged access management systems that help us manage this application traffic and password management for application traffic. SSH user keys, what we see in the space is we see they're most frequently used for machine-to-machine authentication to make things easy. And finally, passwords grant access to the OS level without additional restrictions. SSH user keys, on the other hand, we can actually control both access and privilege level from the key itself. And this is something a lot of people don't actually know about SSH user keys, is you can actually control a lot of what can be done for that interactive or machine-to-machine session using SSH user keys from the key pair itself. And we're going to go into that a little bit in a second. So that's the first area where we wanted to put out some food for thought and consideration that maybe passwords and SSH user keys should be considered in a little bit separate light about how we're managing and considering these across the environment. The second myth that we're going to go into now is we can find all our private keys in our environment. This we see, and we see this over and over again in our projects and our deployments with our customers. This is a very daunting, and we say it's almost a near impossible task. We really argue that this is truly impossible. And why is this nearly impossible? Simply because of this simple string here. This simple string basically allows a user to put in private key wherever they want to, whether that's in their directory on their laptop, in a file share, a folder, could be put into an NFS share, or you could even put it on a USB stick. And moving it on a USB stick makes it extremely portable. You can essentially hide the private key everywhere. Unless you can search everywhere, which is theoretically a very challenging task, it's very hard to go find all these private keys in the environment. They're very transportable. It's very easy. When I go on vacation and I say to my friend Joe, I say, Joe, I'm going on vacation, here's my private key. It's kind of like handing over a password in some ways, but I'm handing over my keys, and that's providing access to all those systems. I leave an organization. I take those private keys home with me potentially. And how do we get that part under control? Myth number 3. If I can control the private key, I can control access into my environment. There's a lot going on in this picture here. We see a lot of traditional jump server architecture going from the philosophy that, hey, we can vault up all these private keys and then we have things really under control. What we see actually in our customer cases, what we get called in a lot for is that exactly we have that scenario there, is we have these systems in place, where they're functioning as a privileged access management, as a jump server architecture for our interactive users coming into the environment, potentially even third parties coming in. And what we see is that this architecture is being bypassed frequently. Once they come in through that session, they drop in their key pair, and they then bypass that privileged access architecture or that jump server architecture that's in place to manage their interactive sessions. And so vaulting those private keys doesn't necessarily always solve that challenge there. Second is it's difficult not to break automated processes in this approach. We see the scenarios of shared private keys a lot. We see these scenarios of these keys being shared, even cross-application in some cases. And we have to be very careful about what we're removing here, because if we break automated processes, especially if you're thinking in the financial sector, potentially you take down a trading platform, this costs a bank potentially millions of dollars every hour for that system going down. So it's difficult not to break automated processes. And vaulting these again at an application level, again, we have now the keys sitting in two places. We have them sitting in a central vault potentially. We have them sitting now at an application level at a vault. It becomes a little bit challenging from a security perspective, but also how we don't go and break the processes. We can't go in and re-script all those automated processes in the environment very easily. So this again is an issue that we want to take under consideration. And secondly, the private key doesn't control access restrictions. Actually, all those access restrictions, when we think about IP source restrictions, if we think about force commands of what can be run during a session, what we want to lock down, all those are run from the lock side of the equation. They're all run from the public key. So when we want to control that access from the private key side, we lock that down from the command restrictions and the source restrictions we put on the public key side of the equation there. So again, this is food for thought in terms of how we approach the problem here and how we're thinking about the challenge overall. Myth number 4, rotating my keys will make me more secure. We get into a lot of discussion with customers where they say, well, I want to go out and I want to discover the keys. I want to get rid of some things that are policy violations like unauthorized root access. I have some weak encryption still sitting out there, and I want to go rotate these keys. And then I think I'll be in a good place. Well, the challenge with this is as long as individuals still have unfettered and uncontrolled ways to set up SSH user keys, and as long as we don't have that visibility in terms of where these keys are being set up from, how these keys are being utilized, as long as we don't have that knowledge in the environment, rotating our keys doesn't really provide us that additional security. So we tend to say rotation without a lockdown process in terms of getting authorized keys off of users' home directories doesn't provide us much additional value. We need to get those authorized keys off of users' home directories so we can control the locks to the doors. And then figuratively, we have to think about it. We're not actually rotating keys. We're actually rotating authorization. We're rotating access. We're rotating the trust, rotating both parts of the equation to be able to put ourselves in a more secure situation there. Again, as said, the access restriction can only be achieved on the authorized key side. Now, if we think about this, we see more and more news coming on about this, and I think one that is very visible to us was the Sony breach. The press is telling us this happened through a spear phishing attack, but what actually happened when the malicious actors were on the inside is they actually went and they grabbed as many private keys as they could. They grabbed private keys into HR systems. They grabbed private key into payroll. And actually a funny thing is we actually saw an ethical hacking session back in November where essentially a hacker, he showed how quickly he could basically take a home camera, he could access the command line, the Linux backbone of that, and basically using SSH, manipulate the camera to be able to send those feeds back to his home desktop. Basically repackage that camera, brings it back to the store, and the next person that buys it, essentially they had access. And we asked him, we said, well, you hack a lot, how often are you using SSH? He said, I use SSH all the time. And then we said, well, how often are you going and stealing keys? And he says, well, it's the first thing I do because I know there's no control and visibility over this. So what happened actually in the Sony breach is they grabbed all the private keys. Now, you have to ask the question, okay, what do I have to do to make myself whole here again? What is it actually what has to be done? And the fact of the matter is I have to either go rebuild my entire application architecture, go try to restructure everything, or I can go change the authorized keys in the environment and rebuild new trust, which we see as valid and strong. And these are really, from our perspective, there's a couple things here. Of course, there's the brand threat, there's the data loss prevention threat, but I think the real threat here related to SSH user keys has to do with resilience. It's that possibility of you can really take down a lot of systems when you have that uncontrolled SSH user access. So I'm going to show that in the next slide here in a case study of what this actually really looks like. So this is actually a financial organization where we've scanned 6,750 hosts across the estate, so on the Linux Unix side. And these are the data points here. I'm gonna cut into a couple of these data points that I want to really put some emphasis on. And don't get me wrong here, we're not saying that the private key is less important or than the authorized key. They're both equally important in the equation, but we're putting our emphasis on where can we control things the best, where do we have the best possibilities to control our environment. So if we look at some of the data points here, the private key to public key ratio in this case is about 1 to 9. So we're finding about 9,500 private keys, 65,000 locks. So there's 9,500 private keys accessing into 65,000 locks in the environment and 22,000 users. Now, let's go to the things that kind of are reason for attention, right? Authorized keys with no source restriction in the environment. So 68% of the authorized keys that we found, 68% of those locks had no source restrictions. So that means if you were able to access to that server in that environment, there was nothing that stopped you from using that as a jump to the next point. And we call this topic transitive trust. How deep can I penetrate into the environment by getting access to a server? We saw on the authorized key side, in 99% of the cases, there was no forced command. So that means regardless of whatever process was behind this, it wasn't locked down. So it couldn't say SFTP only. You can lock down a key to say, this key pair can only do SFTP. It can only run these commands. You can't do this and this with this, right? And so we saw in this case, 99% had no forced commands. Now, even more consideration should be authorized keys for root with no source restriction. We saw 45%. So those keys that had root access had no source restriction. Again, so that means root access and off I go. I can go jump as far as I want to, essentially, right? And then authorized keys for root with no forced command. Well, that makes sense that it says 100% because they're root users. They shouldn't have forced commands on those keys. Now, what we found in that environment is we looked across 6,750 servers here. We saw the key with the largest risk here was able to reach 6,730 servers. So right there, wow, okay, do we have a resiliency concern here? Is this something we need to be looking at? And of course, there's tools out there that we are allowing some widespread root access into our environment, which we have as critical systems, and we keep control of those and we keep an eye on this. So this is kind of, again, feeding into the idea that, wow, we should be looking at the lock side of the equation, what can we control the best. What does this actually look like? So we want to visualize this sometimes, and we help our customers visualize this. So in this case, you can see on the left side, this is what the trust map looks like. So it is a spider web. It's an unmanageable spider web of trust relationships, private keys, public keys, and their associated interactive and machine-to-machine connections. But what's really interesting is as we start to visualize some of these things in more detail, that going back to that third scenario of where people are bypassing the jump host architecture. So you can clearly see in the middle picture here of the red lines and those two white dots down lower of individuals using SSH user key-based authentication from unknown IPs bypassing the jump host architecture in the environment. And they're unknown IPs because they're outside the scope of our scan here, but we can still see, okay, we have these IPs bypassing the jump host architecture. And then in terms of, again, this scenario of unauthorized connectivity from dev to prod, here you see the green in the middle. These are the production hosts in this environment. You see the ones at the top in the yellow. Those are the interactive sessions going directly into the production environment or going into the dev test environment. And the purple and the blue ones, these are the dev to prod connections. So you really see here very clearly in this picture the separation and segregation of duty concern we have related to the key-based authentication, all these connections directly from the test and dev environment right into the production environment. And so this becomes a real attack vector. If you take that, what I showed in the previous slide, around some of those data points, around the lack of forced commands, lack of source restrictions, and you combine this with these concerns around bypassing of jump host architectures and segregation of duties, something that warrants further consideration. So where do we start here? How do we get this under control? You know, we spent a lot of time here at SSH considering about how do we set up a policy. And SSH, we are the co-authors of the NIST IR 7966. So Todd Uhlinen played a really big role in drafting this document together with NIST and putting really down what are the best practices for interactive and automated access for SSH access. And so we started to build policy concepts of how do you really build a strong policy around this. And there's three components to the policy that we want to look at. There's access-based controls as part of the baseline policy. There are cryptographic-based controls as part of the policy. And then part of SSH that we probably don't think about, where we have a lot of control, actually goes into the configuration itself. And so we often get in the discussions with customers is, well, do I have a cryptography problem? Do I have an access problem? Or is this a configuration management problem? And the fact of the matter is, it's all of the above. So what we've done here is we've taken these policies where we have 9 key policies that we're looking at, and we've applied those and said, well, these apply at a service level, an application level, a host level, a user level, or a key level. And think of a service as a group of applications. An application can have a number of hosts. A user can access a number of host applications or services, and a key can cut across many of these, right? So many of these are obvious to us, but you know, we just talked about the segregation of duties. We've been talking about the transitive trust issue, especially in anything that ends in root. We need to lock this down at a user, even at a host level. We need to get this locked down to that granular level. We want to limit the shared private keys by trust and key activity. Should we be, and you see this one here, number 4, it has actually no answer to it because we don't know yet from the data points what the right answer is to this one. The limitation of the number of jumps a key or trust may have. Is there a right answer to this question? We've been thinking a lot about this one, and this is one that we're hoping to get more visibility on as we kind of go forward in our journey as well with our customers, is there a right answer to that one? Should we lock down and say, hey, maximum is two hosts that you can jump, 5 hosts, 10 hosts, whatever it might be. Limitation on unused keys that have never been authenticated, right? We have to get visibility on these. Making sure keys aren't modified outside of business hours. That's one thing we really like to take control of, and you can only have that visibility in the environment if you're monitoring the key-based authentication, monitoring how users are setting up keys in the environment. And so we're building this out and looking this across these multiple levels. I won't go through all of these here. Cryptographic policies, I think these are very obvious. These fit in very normally. We should be looking at things like key age across the spectrum, the size, the length, the algorithm, passphrase protection. As you saw on my slide a couple slides back, 99% of the private keys out there had no passphrase protection. It gives us an extra layer of defense around that key. It is a good practice to put in there, especially if that private key is picked up. They have a little bit more beef around them. And SSH1 keys, these are ones that we want to get out of our environments. And then finally, on the configuration side, you can actually, and we'll take a look really here at point 2 and point 4. So key lockdown, getting keys off of users' home directories. This is what gives us the capability to alert in our environment our keys being set up in an unauthorized fashion. If we get those authorized keys to a user home directory, we're starting to get visibility when people are setting up new keys in an unauthorized fashion really quickly on those servers as we monitor those servers. But you can see here on the policy controls with SSH is you can actually do a lot with restrictions of the types of sub-protocols can be used, the types of protocol versions that can be used. You can restrict root access at this level here, what algorithms are allowed, and logging capabilities. So you have a lot of control already at the configuration level of SSH. So what is our best practice and recommendation of how enterprises should be considering getting this under control? So the first phase is, because the starting point of most organizations is, well, we don't have visibility out there. We don't know what's out there, and it's challenging in that respect. So most important thing is to create that baseline of visibility, to create that inventory, starting with critical applications that are posing the most risk to our environment and working our way down in our application grading levels. And the most important thing that goes with this is monitoring. Without monitoring, discovery doesn't give us much value. We have to be able to see how frequently the keys are authenticating. We see in our project the keys are authenticating billions of times over a couple of year period. These keys are ticking per second for certain trading platforms. How do we find that anomaly, that needle in the haystack of when something is off with key-based authentication in our environment? So monitoring is an essential piece. Phase 2 is the lockdown. This is where we can stop the bleed in our environments, getting the keys off of users' home directories, moving those into a central root-owned structure. Vaulting technologies, they can help us in here as well. There's nothing wrong with locking down our private keys. But it's getting those authorized keys off of users' home directories into a central root-owned structure. We can really control those locks to the critical machines in there. After we've stopped that bleed, we've got visibility, we're monitoring, we're getting educated about what's going on in our environment, we've stopped the bleed, we can actually go in and start to remediate against those policies that we showed in the last 3 slides, starting with those access controls where the risk is the highest or where compliance is driving us to get something fixed. Of course, we're starting off a lot with, let's get root under control. After that, let's get rid of things that are very clear, easy, low-hanging fruits, SSH1 keys, decommission application keys. Let's take a look at these challenges of segregation of duty, anything that's coming into prod. Let's put an IP source restriction on. Let's know exactly from what IP is coming from there. Let's put the force commands on there and lock down those things coming into critical applications in our environment. Let's get looking at those shared private key scenarios there and start to clean these up into what is ideally a one-to-one trust relationship. And then from there, we can go into the nice part of recertification and eventual identity governance, so the automation process of how we automate the distribution, removals, and rotation of keys. And you notice there I said identity governance. Now this is a really big piece of how SSH Communications Security sees this fitting into the overall IAM landscape. We take the position that yes, this is a cryptography issue, this is part of the PKI hardware, but this is also very much part of the access management space and the overall identity access management landscape. And what we're trying to do with our customers is we're trying to link in the process of key management so that every key in the environment, regardless of whether that's for interactive usage or machine-to-machine usage, a service account, application, there is an owner behind it, that we can have accountability for every single trust relationship in our environment, and we can reconcile that access management system when users are leaving the organization, when they're being onboarded into the organization, and we can link this in and function simply as an engine as part of that overall IAM landscape. So this is a really kind of the next level of the discussion, is how do we integrate this concept of key management into our overall identity access management infrastructure so that we link the SSH owner, we link the HR user, we link the application owner and the business owner in an approval process in terms of how keys are provisioned, removed, and rotated, assuring that there's clear ownership of those keys across the environment. So what we've covered today is really just the tip of the iceberg, and we'd really recommend, as time permits, is to take a look at the NIST IR 7966, security of interactive and automated access management using secure shell. You can find this at the link below. It is a free document, and it's really an excellent guideline to reinforce kind of the topics of what we've discussed today, to give kind of you and your organizations additional food for thought on how to start approaching this topic within your environments. With that being said, I wanted to thank everyone for their attention today. I wanted to point out, I hope everyone will join us. I hope this was informative today. I hope everyone will join us for the continuation of part 3 of our series, The Myth of Key Rotation, which is on, I don't know if I have the right date there. I'll let Ruben confirm that in a second. And we'll be sending out notice on that. But at this time, I wanted to hand it back to Ruben to put some questions to Joe, since Joe has been able to sit there quietly for the last 30 minutes or so.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, excellent presentation, and it has garnered a good number of questions, so I'm excited to actually start with the Q&A session at this point, and I will throw them both out to you and Joe, and I'll let you guys pick who you think would be best to answer some of these questions. So one that came in, and some of these might be repeated as I think you maybe answered them, Matthew, but I think they're good ones to also, given the question, repeat. There was the reiteration here. One is here, the first one: can the public user keys be looked for on servers to identify who can connect to the servers over SSH without authentication? So that's the first question. Can the public user keys be looked for on the servers to identify who can connect to the servers over SSH without authentication?
I can take that one, Matthew. Just to confirm, that date on the slide is correct, so our next presentation will be February 24th. So getting back to the question, the way that we do it is we actually do have monitoring tools available that we use with our customers in order to go onto the systems and monitor for 2 things. So we first do a discovery, as Matthew mentioned, and we discover all the public, and in this case also the private keys, but again, like Matthew repeated a few times, that the control is really on the authorized side, or the public key side. And so we look for all those keys, and looking for those keys both on all the servers within it in the environment allows us to build a mapping or a web of the full authorization. Of course, you may have some that show up as unknown private keys that you can't actually find the private keys because, again, you can't scan for everything within the environment. The private keys can be named anything, essentially, and they could be in any directory that you could possibly have on your system in that case. So we do that. That's part of it. The other part that we do is we look at the actual usage of the keys using ongoing usage monitoring scans and things of that sort, and we look at whether the key is actually being used. So it becomes important for a lot of organizations to say, okay, well, let's get rid of the risk of having a key out there that we're not actually using. So we'll go ahead and monitor for a period of months, depending on the situation. Some financials want to do at least over a year end, some over just a quarter, over 2 quarters, things like that. But that monitoring allows us to see whether the key is being used and see if there's a connection coming from a server that maybe we haven't scanned at this point to determine whether the private key would be out there. Or if we scan the server and we still see a connection coming from that server, that means that the private key is in some location that we aren't aware of, and that maybe we need to broaden our scan or maybe lock down that private key or switch out that private key, do a rotation in that matter.
Well, thank you, Joe. A follow-up to that same question is there a way, or the question directly asks, how do we stop users from dropping public keys on a server?
Okay, yeah, so again, I think Matthew mentioned this, but it's worth repeating. As you mentioned, Ruben, some of these would definitely be worth repeating. What we recommend to a lot of our customers is to pull the public keys out of the user's home directory, because as you know, logging in as a particular user allows you to have access to all the directories within that user's home directory. So pulling that out and making the key in the folders have lockdown permissions, meaning they're root owned, they're not owned by the user themselves, prevents anyone other than an administrator, for instance a root user, from adding new keys to that. The second piece that needs to be done there is that the server's configuration file going back to Matthew's point about managing the configurations of SSH as well, those server configuration files need to be updated to allow the location of the public key only to be found within that root on location. Therefore, the user has access still to log in, but they don't have access to add new keys to bypass a jump host or something like that. They are able to log in because the system itself can still access those keys for authentication for that user, but the user itself cannot access those keys to change them or to add new keys to that directory where those keys are located.
Great, thank you, Joe. Matthew, I'm going to ask this one directly of you, and it came earlier, and I think you might have answered it as where to start. But in the initial parts of the discussion during your presentation, someone did inquire saying, well, you know, you created the protocol, SSH did, but what happened to cause the issue to get out of control in regards to key management? And was policy management of keys in the protocol, or is this something new? It's kind of a historical question there. And how did things kind of get to this point, I think would be a good way to summarize that. And did we lose Matthew? Are you there, Matthew?
Sorry about that. I'm on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay,
I'm still here.
Okay, good.
I got it, guys. Can you hear me still? Sorry about that.
Yes, we can hear you fine now. Thank you.
So, yep, no, that's a great question. So basically, I mean, when Tato created this protocol, if you think about how this evolved, is Tato's basically computers at his university back in 1995, someone was sniffing passwords and breaking into the systems. And so Tato basically wanted to create a secure way that he could get from his home desktop into his files at the university. And so he created this encryption protocol, and with that he created this key-based authentication. And so this was let out into the wild, you know, shortly thereafter, to a point where Tato, you know, he no longer wanted to or was capable of answering all the email questions that were coming in about this protocol. You know, it went into the open source community, and it became rapidly adopted. It became a very quick way for enterprises to get, you know, administrative access, you know, in an encrypted fashion, do secure file transfer. And the challenge proliferated itself around the key-based authentication because no one was actually thinking of the security implications at that time of actually what did it mean when I started deploying all these digital keys across my estate. And so historically, this has sat very well in the underworld of Unix administrators and hasn't really been something that has been visible up at the executive level in security organizations and even at a C-level. But as you saw at the beginning, it's like this protocol, it provides us access everywhere. It's really pervasive. And so in this respect, what we've seen, you know, even today in a lot of organizations, is that application owners have their administrators. They need to support their stakeholders. Hey, I need to set up this connection to this point of sale system to the back end, or hey, I need to set up this application connection. Can you set up the key-based authentication? The application owner assigns it to his IT administrator. The IT administrator sets up the key-based authentication, and we forget about it and we go on with our life. Service is done, ticket closed, and we move on. And when you extend that over a period of 10 to 15 years, you end up with scenarios of 1.5 million application keys across 10,000 Unix Linux hosts in an estate. So it can expand itself very quickly.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Another one that came through is regarding what if a private key were to be breached? Is there a way, or can you determine if the host allows access to it? I read that right. Can you determine the host it allows access to? I'm sorry. So if a private key is breached, can you determine the host it allows access to? That's the question. Joe or Matthew?
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Okay.
So traditionally, no. And when you generate a key that you have, or a private and public key pair, you have the ability to put comments in the key. But again, just like with the comment that Matthew made that the passwords are related to users and keys are not directly located, tied to users, the same goes for hosts as well, or those servers that they're on. So when you generate a public and private key pair, there's nothing really that identifies what server you're going to put that public key or that authorization, or again, as we're using the analogy, the lock on. So if the private key is breached and you know that private key is breached, but you don't know what server that public key has been put out on, it's very hard to determine that just from looking at the private key. Sometimes people will put comments in the private keys that will tell you possibly where the destination is, but it's based on an administrator by administrator basis, and it doesn't happen all that often. And that kind of goes back to why we really kind of say that you need to do some ongoing monitoring. You also want to have a good knowledge of where your locks are, where they're sitting on within your infrastructure.
Yeah, but adding on to that, Joe, I mean, essentially you could see this if there was an IP source restriction on the public key side, and if that private key was attempting to be authorized from a different IP, you could pick that up, correct?
Yeah, so that goes the other way. So on the public key side, if you knew the public key side of it, there could be the IP restriction put in place. But maybe I mistook the question. But if the question was related to just you only knew what the private key was, then that would be very difficult. But you're right. If you look at the public key and you have your source restrictions in place, it would allow you, whether that key was breached or not, as long as you felt that server that the source restrictions were set up on the authorization side were secure, then there's less risk. Of course, we always recommend that you rotate if there's a breach, but there definitely, as you mentioned, you can determine the source of those based on the initiating client connections based on the sources on the public key or the lock itself.
Okay, lots of questions coming up, guys. So I'm going to try to have us move, and we're running a little short on time, but I'll try to squeeze some of these in. So maybe we could get a twofer, as I like to say here. One person asked, do we have a recommended discovery and monitoring tool? And another one that just came in was, can you explain, or sorry, let me scroll here a second. It's a follow-up. What does SSH do to secure keys, and can you explain the solution very quickly and the capability? So I think those two about a recommended discovery monitoring tool in association with that last question we could do together. And Matthew or Joe, I'll let you two determine who you'd like to take that in terms of an overview.
Sure, I'll take that. So SSH provides two tools for our customers for this. So one is called a health check. And a health check is essentially a one-time snapshot, what we do with our customers to give them the visibility to help them build the business case in their environment to say, hey, look, we have an issue that we should be taking a look at. And basically the health check is essentially a very simple Perl script which you can run across your Unix Linux estate, across a selected network segment to give you a demographic sampling of the trust relationships out in the environment, how configurations have been set up, what type of versions you have out there, and these type of things that I showed you in that statistical check there. And that can be that script can be run using your configuration management system very easily. You can push that out to a selected set of hosts, and it's going to automatically pull 3 files back to you and give you a one-time output. And SSH can help you build those visualizations and map this out to compliance mandates which are relevant to your organization, whether that's PCI, HIPAA, SOX, whatnot. So that's one side of it. And then from there, what we do is we help our customers build a remediation plan for their environments. And the tool behind this is the Universal SSH Key Manager. So the Universal SSH Key Manager has the capability to go out, discover the trust relationships in the environment using agentless connectivity, agent-based connectivity. We're shortly introducing script-based discovery as well. We turn on using verbose logging in the environment using the Universal SSH Key Manager. We turn on that monitoring capability, and we start to gather that intelligence around that. So that's part of our solution set, which is kind of the entire, let's say, lifecycle management of these trusts in the environment. That solution also has the capability to manage SSH configurations. So from the Universal SSH Key Manager, you can actually go in and do that key relocation of getting keys off of users' home directories and moving those into a central root structure, because to do that process, you actually need to manage the SSH daemon and point that into the new location where those keys are going to be replaced. And so you can do that as a one-click process with the Universal SSH Key Manager. And the Key Manager then takes you through that process flow, which we shared with you there, where you can go into, you can remediate against the policies in your environment and then begin to automate the entire life cycle of the key distribution, removals, rotation, and then link this in, as we were talking about, back into your IDM solution as the final step there to provide that overall long-term governance. Hope that wasn't too long-winded.
No, No, that's great and quick. And the last one that I have that I think ties to exactly what you just said, but I want to be sure to give you the necessary question here. And the question is, how do we propose assigning and managing SSH key ownership through IAM solutions? Did you want to take a minute for that? And then we are running out of time, and I'll have to do a wrap up.
Sure. So SSH's approach to this is there's always that discussion inside environments as well, who has ownership of the keys. So what we like to do is we like to give we want to empower application owners in their environment to be the owners of the security of their application, meaning that they have the rights to put in a request to upload a new key into the environment. They have the right to request that a key will be removed because it's out of policy or keys need to be rotated. And then these calls are pushed back into security ops, which are then running the jobs of the key manager. So we see it as an interplay. But what we do is we see that ownership at an application level, is that those keys at an application level need to be owned. And then if you have that kind of individual ownership, those have to also be assigned back into a user. And so we're just going to link those back in from an application level back into our identity access management system there. And what I was kind of showing in that one previous slide there is that connectivity between the application owner and the business owner, providing those approvals for the provisioning of new keys and whatnot, and then that linking back in to the HR owners and the key manager owners in the environment. Anything you wanted to add, Jeff?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that you could mention, I mean, we also see many of the companies needing to define, like you said, that information on who actually owns the keys, and we also have tools in place that will allow those individual application owners to take ownership as well. I mean, there's a couple different ways that you can, I guess, solve this problem from the ownership standpoint, and one is to provide the onus on the application owners to get the approvals and that, and then the other is from an administrative side and using IAM tools and things like that. So I'll just bring that up. I know we're running short on time, but
we are running short on time. Thank you so much, Matthew and Joe. Just some final housekeeping items here. People were asking, well, how do I get to the prior webinar that was done? By all means, go to ssh.com and click on the resources webinars section, and you'll be able to get the prior recordings as well as this one. This one will be posted in a few days, so you'll be able to re-listen or let others know that they should come here and check it out. And last but least, again, this is the second in a four-part series. The third item here in the webinar series will be the myth of the rotation key, and as was meant, the myth of the key rotation, which will take place on February 24th, 1 p.m. Eastern. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for your time and your very insightful questions today, and we will be talking to you soon. Thank you.